in some manner, Bitcoin is provides an incorruptible language of value, preferable to gold, say. So maybe you have to buy the argument first that gold is preferable to a currency that isn't dependent upon something like gold. And that's also a separate argument. I guess the relationship between action and economics and value, I suppose, is that people choose to act in relationship to those things that they value, and that the manner in which they act is actually an indication of what they value. And so money becomes an index of people's value preferences, and value preferences associated with their preferences for action. I mean, that shapes even such things as perception, because perception, we think about that as something that's automatic, essentially, because the world just appears to us in some sense. But you move your eyes constantly and you orient your head so that you can hear one thing rather than another, and you pay preferential attention to one thing rather than another. And you do all of that as a consequence of comparative value. And I was reading a book on Austrian economics last night, and they were talking about trying to define economics, and it struck me that the most suitable definition was something like the science of comparative value. It looks like that's what economists concentrate on. And then money becomes an index of comparative value. And then that leads, well, I'm going to talk to Robert next. I'll get him to introduce himself. But I know Robert has written a fair bit philosophically on the implications of money in general as a signal of value, and of Bitcoin in particular.
You're always telling your kids to stop being so happy. You don't notice it, but they're running around causing trouble. They're having a wild time. They're throwing their arms in the air and they're laughing and they're running around. They're having fun. You say, hey, quiet down. And if you count your disciplinary actions, you'd be shocked at how often what you're doing is telling your children to stop having so much fun.
Jung thought about the dream as nature speaking of its own accord, roughly speaking. And so his idea was, well, when you sleep, you dream, but the dream happens to you. It's not something that you create the way that, and you don't even think about creating it. Because I might say, well, what are you thinking about? And you'll say, I'm thinking about whatever it is, and you'll take credit in some sense for thinking that, because it seems like a voluntary activity. But what happens at night is that you think, but you think involuntarily. And so what Jung would say is that means that something is thinking in you.
It's disruptive. And you know what happens too if you let your kids have fun out of control? Sooner or later, one of them bangs their head on a table or falls down the stairs or gives another kid a poke, or, like it will, or breaks something, or, it isn't just that it bothers people, it's Dionysian danger. It's orgiastic danger. You get too enthusiastic about things, you get into trouble.
And that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it. And this is one of the things that's uncanny about the psychoanalysts, is they were willing to take their observations to their logical conclusion. There are things that think in you. What are those things? And what are they thinking? And why are they thinking it?
It's not negative emotion that drives teenage pregnancy. It's impulsive positive emotion, right? The problem is, and this actually speaks to what people are like, benefit is finite and risk is infinite.
Now, if you do dream analysis, and this is a tricky thing, because who's to say if your damn analysis is correct, right? It's very difficult to understand that. If you do dream analysis with someone, you generally have them lay out their dream, and then you ask them when they're going through the dream a second time, they lay out their dream and you can kind of get a picture of it. And then they lay out their dream a second time, and as they go through it, every time they mention a detail or a character, you ask them what that reminds them of. And the hypothesis is that
you can die. You can only be so happy. You can be really happy, yeah. You can be just 100% dead. And you're actually kind of wired that way, because people are more sensitive to negative events than to positive events. So a loss will hurt you more than a gain of the same magnitude will please you.
The dream is presenting an image or an idea that's associated with a network of ideas, and that if you can expand on the network of ideas as you go through the dream, you can elaborate on the dream, you can expand it upwards, and you can start to see what it might be attempting to put forward. Now, Freud's idea was that the dream knew what it was doing, but that its content was being suppressed and oppressed by an internal censor. So the dream had to be sneaky about what it was saying because it was going to deliver a message that the person didn't want to hear.
So the reason I'm saying that is because it shows you that we're actually set up for a risky world. Our nervous systems are tuned to be more sensitive to negative information because the world's so damn risky. Now, we'd be completely hiding like a nocturnal animal, except that, we figured out ways to make risk value.
And that was tied up with his idea of repression. But that's not Jung's idea. See, Jung's idea was different. He said, no, the dream is trying to tell you what it's trying to tell you as clear as it can. That's just the best it can do.
So we're ambivalent creatures. We're thrilled by opportunity and terrified by it at the same time, which is exactly how it should be.
And so you could think of the dream, and this is, I believe, the right way to think about it. The dream is the birthplace of thought, the same way that artists are the birthplace of culture. It's exactly the same process. It's that your mind is groping outward to try to comprehend what it has not yet comprehended. And it does that first by trying to map it onto image. And it's doing that in the dream, and it's somewhat incoherent. And
risk is everywhere. That's the first truth of Buddhism, right? Suffering is inevitable. Life is suffering. Same thing. Risk is everywhere. Life is suffering. Period.
Well, let's stick with incoherent, because it's not yet a full-fledged thought. It's the birthplace of thought. It's a fantasy about what might be. And then if you can grip the fantasy and share it with other people, then maybe they can elaborate upon it and bring it into being with more clarity than it would be if it merely existed as the precursor of a thought in your imagination.
So, partly when you're saying, well, can you regulate the collapse of these macro systems? You're saying, well, can you eliminate risk? Well, no, you can't. I don't think. In fact, you could argue, I shouldn't say that exactly. I think there is one way that you can minimize risk.
If you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger.
Don't be crooked.
And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like?
Here's another something worth considering, and I don't know how important it is, but it might be really important. Depends on how important. This is something that Carl Jung said, so it depends on how important Jung is. Now, Freud established the field of psychoanalysis, and with it, investigation, I would say, rigorous investigation into the contents of the unconscious. Modern psychologists and psychiatrists like to, denigrate Freud.
Well, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward.
And I think there's a reason for that. I think that Freud's fundamental insights were so profound and so valuable that they got immediately absorbed into our culture, and now they seem self-evident, and so that all that's left of Freud is his errors.
And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that,
because we believe everything else. We believe all the profound things he discovered. We just take them for granted, and so we don't believe the things that he said that weren't quite on the money, and that's all we credit him with now. But he was certainly the first person who brought up the idea of the unconscious in a rigorous manner, and he was the first person to do a rigorous examination of dreams.
Perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now.
Because the interpretation of dreams is a great book. It's well worth reading. And he was the first person to note that people were, in some sense, inhabited by sub-personalities that had a certain degree of autonomy and independent life.
And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things.